A gun cocks. A woman's sighs. Sir, that mask is a pillowcase. A pillowcase. Do you know what that says about your commitment to this craft? Screaming robbers. Hostages on the floor. Her name is Nikki Caldwell, and she has dealt with worse. If you're already hooked, do us a favor before we go any further. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us grow, and it's what makes it possible for us to keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let's get into it. It was a Friday. The kind of Friday that follows a week so long it feels like it aged you. Nikki Caldwell sat at a corner table in Hanok, one of the nicer Korean restaurants on the east side of the city, still wearing her blazer from work, her natural hair pulled back into a puff that had held up heroically through 9 hours of corporate nonsense. Her heels were off under the table. Her phone was face down. She had ordered the galbi and a sparkling water, and for exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, the world had left her alone. She was 26 years old and already exhausted by people in the specific way that only comes from spending 4 years professionally managing them at their absolute worst. Nikki had worked as of 2 weeks ago when she submitted her notice as a senior customer service training specialist at one of the largest retail conglomerates in the country. Her job, in plain terms, was to take newly hired customer service representatives and transform them into human shock absorbers. She taught them how to breathe through being screamed at, how to de-escalate a grown adult who was losing their mind over a return policy, how to hold a smile while someone tested every boundary known to God and retail management. She was the best in the building. She had been the best in the building since her second year, which was the kind of achievement that earned you a slightly larger cubicle and absolutely no peace. She had survived 4 years of that. 4 years of Karens and Kevins and people who genuinely believed that the customer being right was a spiritual law rather than a marketing phrase someone made up in 1909. She had talked down a woman who had thrown a shoe. She had once spent 45 minutes on a de-escalation call with a man who was upset that a coupon had expired on a Tuesday. She had, on 3 separate occasions, been called things in a professional setting that would have made her grandmother clutch her pearls and reach for the nearest Bible. And she had handled every single one of them. Not because she was patient, not because she was warm, but because Nikki Caldwell had the singular and somewhat terrifying ability to stay completely, utterly, forensically calm when everything around her was falling apart. It was the kind of calm that didn't come from peace. It came from having seen so much chaos that chaos had simply become background noise, which is why, when 3 armed men burst through the front doors of Hanok Restaurant at 8:17 on a Friday evening, Nikki's first reaction was not to scream. It was to look up from her menu, assess, and feel something close to mild inconvenience. The men came in fast, the way people do when they've watched too many heist movies and not enough actual security footage. One of them fired a shot into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down like snow, and the restaurant erupted. Dishes hit the floor. Chairs scraped back. A woman at the table near the window screamed so high and so long it almost became a note. The hostages dropped, hands over their heads, pressing themselves into the floor the way you do when every survival instinct fires at once. Nikki put down her menu. She did not get on the floor. She looked at the 3 men with the slow, careful attention of someone who has spent years reading body language for a living. The first one, the apparent leader, was holding his weapon in a way that suggested he had practiced the pose more than the plan. The second was scanning the room with the jerky, over-wide eyes of someone who was significantly more scared than anyone he was currently threatening. And the third one was wearing a pillowcase over his head. Not a ski mask, not a balaclava, not even a bandana. A white pillowcase with 2 uneven holes cut into it, slightly off-center, so that one I was almost entirely covered. Nikki stared at the pillowcase for a long moment. "Sir," she said. The leader swung toward her. "Get on the floor. Get on the floor right now." "In a moment," she said, with the tone of someone who has paused a meeting to address a typo on a slide. "I just need to say something first, because I genuinely cannot let this go." She looked directly at the man in the pillowcase. "That is a pillowcase. A pillowcase. Do you know what that says about your commitment to this craft. Dead silence. Even the woman who had been screaming stopped. The man in the pillowcase turned his head, which did very little given that one of the eye holes had now slipped entirely off his eye. "What?" "Your mask," Nikki said patiently. "It's a pillowcase. From what I can see, it's a standard 200 thread count cotton blend, probably from a big box store, which means you chose this. Looked at it, thought, yes, this is the face I want to present to the world during a felony, and came here anyway." She tilted her head. "Do you see my concern?" "Lady, I will." "And you," she said, pivoting to the second man without raising her voice even a fraction, "you're holding that sideways. That's not accuracy, that's aesthetics. Those are two different things, and in your current profession, only one of them matters." The restaurant manager, a small man named Mr. Cho who had appeared in the kitchen doorway, was now pressing his entire body against the doorframe and mouthing the words, "Please stop talking," so hard that his lips were going white. The leader took 3 steps toward Nikki's table. He was tall. He was angry. He had a gun and approximately zero idea what to do with a woman who was critiquing his team's equipment while sitting calmly next to a half-eaten piece of bread. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed. Nikki looked at him levelly. "I've been asked that before. The answer depends heavily on the context." She folded her hands on the table. "What I am, currently, is a woman who has had a very long week and was genuinely looking forward to this meal, and I'd appreciate it if you'd either conclude your business here in a professional and expedient manner, or reconsider the whole enterprise." She paused. "The pillowcase is not a good sign, by the way. If I were your supervisor, we would be having a very different conversation right now." Somewhere to her left, in a large private booth screened by a partition of dark wood and frosted glass, a man went completely still. He had been in the middle of a dinner meeting, 3 men on one side, 2 on the other, documents spread across the table, tension running low and controlled the way it always did when he was in the room. His name was Giho Park, and he was not a man who went still for other people. Other people went still for him. But he heard the voice, and something in his chest did something it had not done in a very long time. He held up one hand without looking away from the partition. His men, mid-movement, stopped. His right hand leaned in close. "Boss, we should." "Quiet," Giho said, softly, almost gently. He listened. The voice on the other side of that partition was unhurried and precise. It had a particular quality, a kind of layered calm that carried underneath it the faint suggestion that it had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. The diction was clean. The timing was perfect. It landed every pause exactly where a pause needed to land. He knew that voice. He had heard it every week for 3 years, crackling through a modified FM frequency between 2 and 4 in the morning, narrating the underground street races that wound through the outer districts like veins. He had heard it call a 3-way split-lane overtake with the cool precision of a documentary narrator and the poetry of someone who genuinely loved speed. He had heard it the night the Nakamura cruise driver blew a rear tire at 140 and barely kept the car on the road, and the voice had said, without missing a beat, and that, gentlemen, is what we call a conversation with God. He said, "Go slower." The driver declined. Giho had laughed, out loud, alone in his car, at 3 in the morning. He had the recording saved. He had listened to it 11 times. The voice on the other side of the partition was the same voice. He was certain of it in the way you are certain of a song you've heard 100 times, even when it's playing in a different room. Same cadence, same architecture, same complete and unshakable refusal to be rattled by anything the universe chose to throw at it. He stood up. They looked alarmed. "Boss, handle the men," Giho said quietly. "Carefully. No miss." "And the woman?" Giho straightened his jacket. "Leave her to me." The robbery ended in under 2 minutes. It ended the way things always ended when Giho Park decided they were over, efficiently, quietly, and with a minimum of spectacle. His men moved through the restaurant like they were performing a routine they had rehearsed, which, to some extent, they had. The 3 robbers found themselves disarmed and seated on the floor near the bar before any of them had fully processed what was happening. The man in the pillowcase was still trying to fix his eye hole when someone gently but firmly relieved him of his weapon and suggested he stay where he was. Nikki watched all of it from her table. She picked up her sparkling water. She took a sip. She was replacing her glass when she became aware of someone standing beside her table, and she looked up to find a man she did not know looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. He was Korean, maybe late 30s, with a face that was composed in the way that expensive things are composed, like the stillness had been built in deliberately. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him the way suits fit people who do not buy suits off racks. His hands were at his sides. He was not threatening her. He was also not threatening her. He was, she thought, in that specific register that powerful people occupy, where the threat is architectural rather than active. It's in the structure. You feel in the room. She looked at him. He looked at her. I have a question, he said. Most people do, she said. He was quiet for a moment, as if recalibrating for someone who gave that answer. Then he said, have you ever narrated a street race? On an FM frequency. Between 2 and 4 in the morning. Nikki set her water glass down very carefully. She looked at him for a long count of 5. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced his phone, and pressed play. Her own voice filled the space between them, bright and alive and completely, unmistakably hers. Narrating a race through the South Corridor, 2 cars, a quarter-mile, the kind of night where the city smelled like rain and burning rubber and something that felt almost like freedom. Nikki listened to 4 seconds of it. Then she picked up her menu and looked at the dessert section. Check, please, she said to no one in particular. His name, she found out later, was Giho Park. She found this out not because he told her. He had, in fact, said very little after she called for the check, but because Simone looked him up in approximately 45 seconds using nothing but a physical description and an area code, which said a lot about what Simone did with her free time. Giho Park, Simone said over the phone, with the energy of someone reading out lottery numbers. 37, Korean-American, runs the Park organization, which is officially it's a hospitality and real estate holding company, but the 3 asterisks next to that in this article suggest. Simone, he's connected Nikki, like connected, as in the kind of connected where people cross the street when his name comes up in conversation. Nikki was sitting on her couch with her shoes back on because she had not quite mentally arrived home, yet despite being physically present. She was still wearing the blazer. There was a half-empty, sparkling water on the coffee table that she had brought from the restaurant in her bag because she had paid for it, and no one had said she couldn't. I know what connected means. Do you know what it means that he talked to you specifically? It means he heard something he thought he recognized, and he was wrong. Nikki, he was wrong, Simone. Simone made a sound on the other end of the line that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. Girl, he played you your own voice. A voice. A similar voice. Lots of people have. It was you. I have heard you do that thing with your voice, where you get all precise and low, and you sound like you're narrating a nature documentary about human failure. And I'm telling you, whatever he played in that restaurant was the same voice you use when you're judging somebody, and you want them to know it. Nikki said nothing. Was it you? Simone asked. Another silence. Longer this time. I want it on record, Nikki said finally, that I had a completely normal side hustle that hurt no one and required no interaction with anyone in person, and I am not responsible for whoever decided to listen to it. Simone screamed. Not in fear. In delight. The kind of scream that is basically applause in audio form. I knew it. I knew you were Midnight. I told Keisha in 2022, I thought it was you, and she said I was reaching. I'm hanging up. Nikki. Good night, Simone. She hung up. She sat in the quiet of her apartment for a moment, looking at nothing. Then she lay back on the couch, stared at the ceiling, and let herself feel the specific low-grade dread of someone who has been found out by someone they cannot easily dismiss. Because here was the thing about Midnight. Midnight had started as an accident. 3 years ago, Nikki had been killing time at a friend's garage on the outskirts of the city. Someone she'd known from her neighborhood, a mechanic named Darnell, who ran in circles that got fast and loud after dark. She'd gone to watch a race once, just to watch, because she had always loved cars in the abstract, loved the physics of them, loved the specific language of speed. And she made a comment, one comment out loud, to Darnell about the driving pattern of one of the cars, and someone with a radio rig had heard her and laughed and said, "You should be calling this." So she did. Once. As a joke. The feedback had been immediate and overwhelming. People called in asking who she was. Recordings of her commentary circulated online before the sun came up. By the following week, she had a frequency, a name, and a regular slot. By the end of the first month, Midnight was a fixture of the underground circuit. Not a face, not a name, just a voice that made the races feel like something worth witnessing. She had never told anyone at work. She had never told her family. She had told Darnell to tell people she was a friend of his from out of town if anyone asked. And that had been enough because the underground circuit ran on an unspoken agreement that you didn't ask too hard about the people inside it. She had been safe, private, separate. And then she had gone to dinner and criticized a robbery, and now a man with 3 asterisks next to his name in a news article knew her voice. She closed her eyes. She was going to need a bigger couch cushion to scream into. The next morning, Giho Park was standing outside her gym. Not inside, outside, leaning against the wall beside the entrance with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of someone who has been there long enough to be comfortable and intends to be there longer. He was not in a suit today. Dark trousers, a charcoal pullover, nothing that announced itself. He looked, she thought irritably, like an advertisement for something she couldn't afford and didn't need. She stopped walking when she saw him. She considered turning around. She calculated the math of whether she could pretend she hadn't seen him, decided that the calculation was insulting to both of them, and walked forward. "You found out where I go to the gym," she said, stopping in front of him. "I found out where you go to the gym," he confirmed without apology. "That's not something I said because I thought it was acceptable." "I know, and you're doing it anyway. I want to talk to you." Nikki looked at him for a moment. Then she shifted her gym bag on her shoulder and said, "You have until I reach the door." He fell into step beside her without hesitation, which told her he had done this before, walked alongside someone who hadn't given full permission and made it feel like he belonged there anyway. "I want to offer you a position." "No, you haven't heard what it." "No." She pulled the door open. "I have a career. You gave your notice 2 weeks ago." She stopped. The door swung, slowly closed against her hand. She turned to look at him with the careful attention of someone filing information. "You did more than find out where I go to the gym." He met her eyes without any visible discomfort. "I did. That should be more alarming to you than it apparently is. What I do requires me to understand people quickly," he said. "You're 26. You're one of the best at what you do. You quit without another job lined up, which means you quit because you needed to, not because you had a plan. That's not recklessness. That's someone who hit a limit." He paused. "I'm offering you something that won't bore you." Nikki stood there for a moment. "I don't want to work for you," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to ask anyway." She went inside and did not invite him in. But she stood at the front desk a few seconds longer than she needed to before heading to the locker room, and she was aware of it, and it annoyed her considerably. He came back the next day. Not to the gym. He was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment at exactly the time she always went, sitting at a corner table with a black coffee and a folder he wasn't reading. When she walked in and saw him, she stopped, looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of someone asking God a question they already know the answer to, and then walked to the counter and ordered her usual before sitting down across from him without being asked because standing would have been less dignified than sitting. "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "For a while," he said. "That's harassment." Technically. Technically is a word people use when they're about to say something I don't want to hear. So I'm going to stop you there. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What exactly do you think I can do for you that your entire organization can't?" He looked at her with those even, quiet eyes. "Last night in that restaurant, 3 armed men had an entire room of people on the floor inside of 30 seconds. You were the only person in that room who didn't react to the fear. You assessed, you analyzed, and then you dismantled them. Not with force, with language. With framing." He paused. "In the 12 years I've been running my operation, I have had access to every kind of asset you can imagine. I have never had access to someone who can do what you did in that restaurant and make it look like mild inconvenience." Nikki looked at him. He looked back. "I called a robbery unprofessional," she said. "You neutralized the emotional temperature of the room in under 2 minutes using nothing but your voice and your certainty," he said. I've paid a great deal for that in other people and received far less. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to be very clear that I'm not interested in your world or what happens inside it. Noted, I'm not going to do anything illegal. I'm not asking you to. I don't know why you think any of this is a good idea. He lifted his coffee. Because I've been listening to your voice for 3 years, he said simply, and every single time, you were the most interesting person in the room, even when you weren't physically in the room. He set the cup down. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's the obvious idea. Nikki stared at him. She thought about the jobs she'd quit, the ones she'd looked at since, the ones that all blurred together into one long, beige corridor of managed expectations and professional mediocrity. She thought about the way her brain had lit up quietly and without permission the previous night in that restaurant when 3 chaos variables had walked through the door and she had handled them without breaking a sweat. She thought about how she had not once been bored. She looked down at her coffee. One conversation, she said. Sit down. You tell me exactly what you're asking for, and I tell you whether it's something I'll consider. That's not a yes. That's not an agreement. It's information gathering. That's all I'm asking for, he said. It was not, as it turned out, all he was asking for. But in that coffee shop on a Saturday morning with the autumn light coming through the windows and her coffee going warm in her hands, Nikki Caldwell made the first decision that would change the entire shape of her life. She said yes to the conversation. The sit-down happened the following Tuesday, in a private room above a restaurant she'd never been to, with a view of the city that she refused to be impressed by out of principle. Day was there, which she hadn't expected, a compact, observant man in his early 30s who had the particular stillness of someone who was always doing 2 things at once, the visible thing and the invisible thing, and who looked at Nikki with the detached assessment of a man vetting something expensive. She looked back at him with equal energy. He broke first, barely, and only by looking at his folder, but she clocked it. She filed it away. Giho laid out the ask across the table with the same clean efficiency he apparently applied to everything. He had a situation, a negotiation that had stalled, a rival faction that had been positioning aggressively for 3 months, and a communication gap in his own structure that was creating friction between his upper and lower tiers. He needed someone who could read a room, architect a conversation, and deliver a message in a way that landed without escalating. He was not asking her to be in the field. He was not asking her to do anything outside the frame of what she had already done professionally. He was asking her to use the same skills she had spent 4 years mastering in a corporate context and apply them somewhere that actually had stakes. Nikki sat through the presentation without interrupting. Then she sat for a moment in silence. The negotiation that stalled, she said. What's the block? Giho's eyes settled on her with what she was starting to recognize as his version of attention. Total, unhurried, like whatever she said next was the only thing in the room. Pride, he said. The other party feels they've been addressed as subordinates. They're not subordinates. They're independent. The framing was wrong from the beginning. Who did the framing? A very small pause. My people. So the message was fine, but the delivery created a status wound, she said. And now the other party is holding position, not because the deal is bad, but because accepting it feels like confirming that they're beneath you. Yes, that's not a negotiation problem, she said. That's a dignity problem. Those are different solutions. She tilted her head. You need them to feel like they're choosing to accept the deal rather than being handed it. Yes, he said again. He was looking at her the way people look at something they've been searching for. She found it uncomfortable. She made a note of that too. I'll sit in on it, she said. I won't speak unless I decide it's necessary. If I speak, you don't contradict me in the room. Afterward, you can have whatever opinion you want, but in the room, you let it land. Day looked up from his folder. Giho said, agreed. And I'm not your employee, she said. I am consulting. Those are different things legally and in terms of what I'll tolerate. Understood. And someone needs to do something about that pillowcase situation from the restaurant, because I will not sleep knowing it's still unaddressed. Giho blinked. It was the first time she'd seen anything like surprise on his face. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the architectural suggestion of one. And he said, I'll look into it. The negotiation happened the following Thursday. The other party arrived already defensive, which Nikki had predicted, and which was useful because defensiveness has a shape and a rhythm, and she knew how to work with it the way a musician knows how to work with a difficult key. She sat slightly off to the side, not at the table, not outside the room, but in the periphery, present but not fronted. For the first 12 minutes, she said nothing. She watched. She cataloged. She watched the lead man on the other side tap his ring finger twice on the table, every time Giho's team said something that landed wrong. She watched his second-in-command angle his body away from the table by degrees, millimeter by millimeter, the way people do when they're preparing an exit they haven't decided to take yet. She watched Giho across from them, controlled and precise, saying the right things in a way that was nevertheless creating a faint but unmistakable register of pressure, and she understood that the content was correct, but the container was wrong. At the 14-minute mark, during a pause in which both sides were realigning, she said, "Can I say something?" Everyone looked at her. She looked at the man across the table, the lead, the one with the ring tap, and she said without any particular softness and without any edge either, just the clean level register of someone speaking a true thing. "I think what you've been hearing in this conversation is that you're being offered terms. What I want to say is that you're being asked to choose terms. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't think that distinction has been made clearly enough, and I think that's been unfair to you." The room was quiet. The man across the table looked at her for a moment. His ring finger was still. "The position your organization is in," she continued, "is one that you built. Nobody at this table is confused about that. What's being proposed is something that works because of what you built, not in spite of it. If that's not how it's been communicated, then someone owes you a cleaner conversation. And this is that conversation." She stopped talking. The man across the table sat back slightly. The second-in-command, she noted, had re-angled his body toward the table. By 2 degrees. Small, but real. 20 minutes later, the deal was done. On the way out, Dave walked beside her for a moment. He didn't say anything, but when they reached the elevator, he pressed the button for her floor before she reached it. She didn't mention it, but she noticed. Giho said nothing to her until they were outside and the other cars had gone. Then he said, simply, "You told them the truth." "I told them the truth they needed to hear in the order they needed to hear it," she said, which was different, and they both knew it. He looked at her in the particular way he had, the one she still hadn't filed into a known category. Then he said, "Same time Thursday?" She had meant to say no. She had prepared a version of no that was professional and final and left no room for follow-up questions. "Fine," she said. She got in her car. She sat for a second before starting the engine. She realized with profound annoyance, not bored. The following 3 weeks had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. She came in for the things she'd agreed to come in for, and she was precise about the scope, and she maintained the fiction of consulting rather than belonging. She sat in on 2 more negotiations. She rewrote an internal communication that had been causing friction between Giho's organization and one of their legitimate business partners. She did it in 20 minutes, and the problem dissolved so cleanly that Day had stood in the doorway of the room she'd been working in for a full 10 seconds before walking away without speaking. She also, in her off hours, returned to the radio. She had stopped briefly after the restaurant incident, uncertain whether midnight was compromised as an identity, but she missed it, missed the way the world simplified down to speed and darkness and the voice that got to describe it. She went back on a Tuesday night, settled into the frequency, and let herself be midnight again for a few hours. The next morning, Giho handed her a coffee. Exactly right, the way she'd never told him she took it, and he had somehow cataloged anyway, and said quietly, "Good race last night. The one through the South Bend, especially." She took the coffee. She looked at him. She said nothing, but something shifted, small and significant, somewhere in her chest. The complication arrived on a Wednesday, the way complications always do, not announced, not dramatic, just suddenly there when you look up like furniture you walked into in the dark. A detective named Torres came to Nikki's apartment at 7 in the morning with a badge and a cardboard coffee cup, and the specific energy of someone who has been doing this long enough to have developed a theory and is now collecting the evidence to fit it. She was mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of patience that wasn't warmth, it was strategy. She sat in Nikki's living room and asked about the restaurant. Nikki was cooperative. She was always cooperative in situations like this because she knew something that most people didn't. In a conversation with an authority figure who is fishing, the most dangerous thing you can do is say more than you were asked. She answered the questions she was asked. She didn't answer the ones she wasn't. She offered Detective Torres water. She offered it in the way she had once offered a disgruntled client the option of speaking to a supervisor, as a gesture that slightly reset the register of the conversation without changing its content. Torres left with what she came with and not much more. But she left a card, and she said, as she stood in the doorway, "The men who came into that restaurant work for a faction that's been building against the park organization for about 8 months. Whatever brought you into that room, Miss Caldwell, I'd think carefully about what keeps you there." Nikki closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Simone. "There's a detective," she said when Simone picked up. Simone said, "Nikki, I know. I told you," I said. "You didn't tell me anything, you just made a face. A face that meant something." "Simone, focus." Nikki moved to the window, looking down at the street below, without really seeing it. The robbery at the restaurant wasn't random. It was connected to a faction that's moving against Giho's organization. And because I was on camera looking like I was with them. Were you with them? I was eating galbi. I was alone. I had taken my heels off. Right, sorry, continue. Because I was on camera, not reacting, and because I have subsequently been seen associating with Giho's people, there are now 2 separate parties who have questions about who I am. She pressed her fingers to her temple. The detective thinks I might be an asset or an insider. The rival faction, she paused. I don't know what the rival faction thinks, but I don't think it's nothing. Simone was quiet for a beat. When she spoke again, the delight had shifted into something more careful. "So what do you do?" "I go talk to Giho," Nikki said, "and I tell him that his problem is now my problem, and I need to know the full shape of it." That sounds like the opposite of stepping back. "I know. Nikki, baby, girl, be honest with me. How much of this is actually about the threat assessment, and how much of it is that you find this fascinating and also possibly the man himself is not difficult to look at?" "Goodbye, Simone." She hung up. She stood there for another moment. Then she grabbed her jacket. The meeting with Giho was not in a conference room or a restaurant this time. It was in a workspace, a clean, high-ceilinged room above one of his legitimate properties, a building that smelled like coffee and paperwork and the faint echo of normalcy. He was at a long table with Day and 2 others when she came in, and he looked up at her the way he always did, with that full, quiet attention, and she walked to the table and sat down without being invited and said, "Tell me about the CO faction." They looked at Giho. Giho looked at Nikki. "How do you know that name?" he said. "I don't," she said. "A detective said rival faction, and I'm asking you to fill in the blank because a detective came to my apartment this morning, and I need to understand what I'm in the middle of." Something changed in Giho's expression. It was slight, and it passed quickly, but she caught it, a tightening just for a second around the eyes. It wasn't anger. It was closer to something she hadn't seen on him before. Concern. "She came to your home," he said, "at 7 in the morning. Cardboard coffee cup, comfortable shoes. She's been on this a while." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Day and said something in Korean that she didn't catch, and Day nodded once and got up and went to a different part of the room. "The CO faction has been expanding for 18 months, Giho said, turning back to her with the focused brevity of a man choosing what to say carefully. "They operate in our same territory. The robbery at Hannock was a message. They targeted a restaurant I'm known to frequent. The fact that you were visible on camera, not behaving like a frightened civilian, has made you a person of interest to them. They will want to know who you are and what your connection to me is." "And what do I tell them when they ask?" "They won't ask," he said. "They'll assess first." Nikki held his gaze. "So, I'm being watched. Possibly. By your rivals. Possibly. Because I insulted a man's pillowcase." For a moment. And it was brief, and he didn't let it fully form. Something flickered at the corner of Giho's mouth. In a manner of speaking, he said. She sat back. She thought about Torres and her comfortable shoes and the careful way she'd framed her parting shot. Not as a warning, as an invitation to reconsider. She thought about the rival faction watching and not knowing what they were looking at yet. She thought about herself at 26, sitting in this room above a building that smelled like paperwork, calculating risks she had never planned to calculate. She thought about how she wasn't afraid. That was interesting. That was worth noting. Okay, she said. Then I need to be something coherent. Not an accident. Not a woman who happened to be at a restaurant. If I'm visible to both sides, I need to be visible as something specific and defined, because ambiguity is a liability. That's why I offered you the position, he said quietly. I know, she said. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She was 26 years old, and she had spent 4 years being the most capable person in a room that wasn't worth her capability, and now she was in a room that was, and the thing sitting in her chest wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement either. It was something more like recognition. The feeling of finding a door that fits the particular shape of your hand. She looked up at him. I'm not your employee, she said. I want that in writing if there's anything in writing. There isn't. Then I want it said clearly in front of Day right now. Giho looked at Day. Day, who had returned to his position near the wall, looked back at Giho with the expression of someone who had somehow expected this turn of events without being able to explain how. She's not an employee, Giho said. She's my consigliera. Nikki opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She turned the word over. Consigliere. Not an assistant. Not a consultant. Not a liaison or an advisor or any of the tidy, corporate-shaped titles she had spent years operating inside. Consigliere. The one who counsels. The one whose voice matters in the room. The one who stands beside the person making decisions and tells them the truth they need to hear. She thought about 23-year-old Nikki who had taken a call center job to pay rent and turned out to be so good at it that they built a training program around her. She thought about the voice on the frequency that had somehow, without trying, become a thing people drove across the city to hear. She thought about a restaurant and a pillowcase and a gun that had been cocked and a woman who had sighed. She thought about doors and shapes and hands. We're going to have to discuss the title, she said. We can discuss it later, Giho said. There are going to be conditions. I'd expect nothing else. Day said nothing. He did, however, get up and refill her water glass. She decided that counted as agreement. The formal introduction happened on a Thursday that Nikki had not been told was going to be a formal introduction. She had been told it was a routine meeting. She had dressed accordingly, clean, professional, the kind of presentation she had always maintained on instinct. And she had walked into a room containing 41 people and understood within approximately 3 seconds that she had been lied to by omission. The room was large and arranged with the specific geometry of organized hierarchy. Giho was at the front. His captains, she had learned the word reluctantly. The way you learn the vocabulary of a country you've accidentally moved to, were arranged in a loose semicircle, and everyone else spread back from there. There was a low, attending silence, the kind that happens when a large group of people who are accustomed to discipline are waiting for something to be said. Giho said it. He introduced her as his consigliera. Her name, her role, 6 sentences clean and final, the way he said everything. 41 people looked at her. Nikki looked at Giho. The look she gave him was the look she had once given a senior manager who had announced in a department meeting, without prior discussion, that Nikki would be heading a project she hadn't agreed to. It was not a look of anger. Anger was too blunt an instrument for this. It was a look of precise and total communication. It said, I see exactly what you've done. We will be discussing this. Your position on the matter will not be considered. Giho held her gaze without flinching. The 40 people wisely found other things to look at. She waited until the room had cleared. Then she closed the distance between them in the unhurried way she'd always closed distance with difficult people, steadily, without aggression, but with the unmistakable sense that she was going to arrive, and when she did, the conversation was going to happen whether you were ready or not. You announced a title, she said, that I had not accepted, in front of 40 people, which means you use social contract and the presence of witnesses to make it difficult for me to decline without creating a power disruption in your organization that would then become my problem to manage. Yes, he said. You did that deliberately. Yes. That's manipulative. It's strategic, he said. They're different things. They're not different. You would have kept finding reasons to defer the decision, he said. And he said it without impatience, without pressure, just that same level directness he brought to everything. You've been here for 3 weeks. You've done the work of someone who belongs here. You've done it better than anyone I've had in this function, and you've been doing it while telling yourself and me that you don't belong here because you need an exit to feel safe. He paused. I understand why you need the exit. I'm telling you that the work is real and the position is real, and you're not less of a free person because I gave you a title for what you're already doing. She looked at him. She hated that it was well-reasoned. If you ever do something like that again, she said, I will call you out in front of those 40 people with a level of precision and clarity that will require them to go home afterward and think about their own life choices. Do you understand me? Completely, he said. Good. She straightened her jacket. I have notes on the communication structure between your mid-tier and the outer operations. There are 3 recurring friction points that are causing delay, and they're all fixable without personnel changes. I'll make time this afternoon, he said. She walked past him. She did not look back, but she was aware, with the particular peripheral awareness she had developed in 3 weeks of operating in his orbit, that he was watching her go with the expression she still hadn't filed into a category, the one that was quiet, and even and contained something underneath it that she was increasingly, stubbornly, determinately not naming. The CO faction moved 2 weeks later. It was not the dramatic confrontation she might have anticipated from a build-up. It was smarter than that, which told her something about their leadership that she filed away. They targeted one of Giho's legitimate operations, a restaurant supply company, quiet and unglamorous and foundational, by moving a competing contract through channels that appeared independent but weren't. It was meant to look like market competition. It was meant to apply pressure without creating a direct conflict that could be named and addressed. Nikki read the contract documents. She sat with them for an evening. She made a list. The next morning, she sat across from Giho and said, They're not trying to take the contract. They're trying to demonstrate to your legitimate partners that you're vulnerable. The revenue is secondary. The message is the target. He looked at her. And the way you counter a message is with a better message, not with a counter move. If you respond with force or leverage, you confirm the vulnerability. If you respond by simply running the contract better than they can, faster delivery, better margins, no disruption, you counter the message without acknowledging it. They said you're weak. You say nothing. You just aren't. A long quiet. You're saying do nothing. I'm saying do the thing you're already doing, but do it deliberately and do it loudly enough that the right people notice. She placed the contract documents in front of him. There are 3 partners in this chain who are watch and see. They haven't decided what the CO action means yet. We reach out to those 3 before the end of the week. Not about the contract. Not about the threat. We bring them something they want. Information, access, consideration. And we do it now, when it reads as confidence rather than desperation. Giho looked at the documents. He looked at her. Then he said Day. Day appeared from the edge of the room. He looked at Nikki, set up meetings with the 3 flag partners. Giho said, Her calendar, not mine. Day looked at her. Nikki looked at Day. For a moment, they regarded each other with the mutual measuring energy that had characterized their entire dynamic. Him assessing her accounting for his assessment, neither quite willing to break the formality of it. Then Day said, How do you take your coffee? She blinked. Why? Because these meetings will run long, and you'll need it. She looked at him for one more second. Then she told him. He wrote it down. He left. She turned back to her documents. She allowed herself, very privately, one small breath of something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite warmth but lived in the neighborhood of both. The meetings ran exactly as long as she predicted. The 3 partners received exactly what they needed in exactly the register that made it land as strength. By the end of the week, 2 of them had verbally confirmed their positions. The 3rd took until Monday morning, which she had also predicted. They told Giho, Giho told no one, but that evening, when they were the last two left in the workspace, going through notes for the following week, he put a coffee on the table next to her. She looked at it. Exactly right. You've been listening to a lot of races lately, he said, settling across from her with his own cup. She picked up her pen. The schedule's been active. The commentary on the Tuesday race was different, he said. The North Quarter run. You held back in the middle section. She looked up at him. I listened live, he said, without any particular weight. Like it was just information. Like it wasn't the most oddly intimate thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could track. I've noticed when the commentary's different. It's usually when something is on your mind. She held his gaze. She thought about 12 things at once. She thought about distance and professionalism and the fact that she was 26 and he was 37 and she was supposed to be a consultant and not even that technically, and there were 40 people down the hall who called her by a title she hadn't officially accepted, and a detective who had left a card on her coffee table, and a best friend who had been sending increasingly unsubtle texts for weeks. She thought about how, sitting here with bad takeout, going cold at the edge of the table and city light coming through the window, and the specific quiet of a night that had earned its quiet, she was more alive in her own brain than she had been in 4 years. She said, the South End reroute throws off my rhythm. New concrete, different acoustics. He nodded, accepted it, did not push. They went back to the notes. But she noticed, 10 minutes later, that he had moved his chair 2 inches closer to her side of the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't move her chair away, either. The night the CO faction made their final move, the city was raining. It was the kind of rain that arrives with intention, steady, cold, filling every space between things. Nikki was in the workspace late when the call came, and she watched Giho's face as he listened, and she read it the way she had learned to read every room she'd ever entered. Structure first, then texture, then the thing underneath that no one thinks you can see. What she saw underneath was control alarm. When he hung up, he said, they've called a meeting. Who called it? Neutral party. Third-party mediation request. They want to negotiate directly. Or they want to put us all in one room, Day said from the doorway. Also possible, Giho said. Nikki was already turning it over. A direct negotiation request through a neutral channel. If it was legitimate, it was an off-ramp from an escalation that had been building for weeks. If it wasn't legitimate, it was a consolidation play, a move to read the composition of Giho's inner circle and test its stability in a high-pressure live setting. Either way, the answer was the same. You went. You went prepared. You went presenting a surface that could not be read. I want to sit in, she said. Nikki, not beside you, she said. Not as consigliera. I'll be introduced as a communications specialist. Neutral title, no hierarchy implied. I sit off to the side. I observe. If the conversation degrades, you look at me before you respond to anything they say. He looked at her. One look, she said. That's the signal. You look at me, you give me 2 seconds, then you respond. 2 seconds changes the outcome of a conversation more than almost anything else, and I want those 2 seconds to route through me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right. The meeting happened the following evening in a building that was technically neutral and practically wasn't. She identified 3 of the CO faction's peripheral people in the lobby alone, which told her they'd arrived first and shaped the space, which is a power move she logged and set aside for use. She sat where she'd said she would sit, slightly off-axis, a legal pad in front of her, projecting the specific energy of a professional support role. Present, capable, and not the point. The CO faction lead was named J1, and he was impressive in the particular way that dangerous people who know they're dangerous tend to be. He was composed. He was well prepared. He spoke with the measured confidence of someone who had thought through the conversation and believed he knew where it was going. He did not know about Nikki. The meeting opened with the usual architecture, pleasantries, framing, the laying out of positions. Nikki watched and wrote nothing. She watched J1's team. She watched which of them looked at Giho and which of them looked at her and what each kind of looking meant. She watched the rhythm of the conversation, the way it wanted to pull toward a particular current, and she tracked where that current was taking them. 20 minutes in, J1 made his move. He framed it as a proposal, but it was structured as an ultimatum, a set of terms presented with just enough surface reasonableness to be hard to reject without looking unreasonable. It was well constructed. She gave him credit for that. Giho looked at her. She held up 2 fingers very slightly below the level of the table. He waited 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she made a small gesture, a micro-adjustment, a tilt of her head toward the second member of J1's team, a man who had been angling forward in his chair since the proposal started. Interested, invested, wanting it to land. Giho looked back at J1 and said, "That's an interesting frame. Let me understand it correctly." And then he asked a clarifying question, not a pushback, not a counter, just a question that made the second man across the table sit forward another inch. The question had moved the conversation from confrontation to clarification, and you could feel the room shift temperature by half a degree. Nikki said nothing. She wrote 1 word on her legal pad. Good. The meeting resolved in 90 minutes. Not with celebration, not with warmth, but with an agreement that both sides could bring back to their people without losing face, which was, she had always believed, the only kind of agreement that held. J1 shook Giho's hand with the expression of a man who had expected to win more and had arrived at an outcome that was nevertheless acceptable. His second man looked quietly relieved. In a lobby afterward, Dave fell in a step beside her and said, very quietly, so only she could hear the 2-finger thing. "Yes," she said. "That was good." She looked at him. He was looking ahead. His face was doing the day thing, where it was completely neutral and somehow simultaneously communicating a whole paragraph. "Thank you, Day," she said. He said, which, from Day, was essentially a standing ovation. Outside, in the rain, when the cars had arranged themselves and the others had dispersed, Giho stood beside her for a moment, not moving toward the car yet, just standing. The rain was fine and cold, and the city was doing what it did at night, glittering and indifferent and going on without them. "It's done," he said. "For now," she said. "J1's not finished. He'll regroup and come back with something more refined. But you've got time now. Because of you." She looked at the rain. "Because you listened." He was quiet. Then he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "The first time I heard Midnight," he said, and his voice had shifted. Not much, but enough. The way you can hear when someone has stopped performing calm and is just being it. I was having a very bad year. I won't go into the specifics, but I was in my car at a parking structure at 3 in the morning, and I had just made a decision I didn't feel good about, and I turned on the frequency because it was something to fill the quiet. He paused. "You were calling a 2-car run through the East Corridor." You said. He stopped. He seemed to locate something. You said, "And here's the thing about the dark. It doesn't slow you down. It just makes you rely on something other than your eyes." You meant the drivers. But I kept that. She looked at him. The rain fell between them and around them, and the city went on behind him, enormous and lit and not watching. She said, "I didn't know anyone was keeping that." "I kept everything," he said simply. She stood there in the rain, 26 years old, 1 month into something she still didn't have a clean word for, and she felt something unlock in her chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a door opens when you've had the key in your hand without knowing it. The click was small, and it was real, and it changed the pressure of the room. She said, "Giho." He looked at her. "I'm going to need you to understand that I am a person with opinions and standards and a very specific professional code, and I will apply all of those things to you as readily as I apply them to everyone else." "I know," he said, "and I'm not going to stop being annoyed by things you do. I'd be concerned if you did, and I haven't officially accepted the title." "I know," he said again. "But she stopped. She looked at the rain. She looked back at him. She was not a woman who tripped over her words, had never been a woman who tripped over her words, had spent 4 years training people to use language precisely. And yet there she was, in a parking lot in the rain, aware for the first time in longer than she could account for that the right words required a different kind of courage than the useful ones. She said, "I'm not bored." He looked at her. For the first time in a very long time, she said, "I'm not bored. And I don't think that's just the work." The silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. He reached out, very slowly, and she could have stepped back, and she did not, and he tucked a rain-damp braid back from her face with a care that was so deliberate it almost undid her. And he said, I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, don't be smug about it. He said, I would never. And she laughed, genuine, full, the kind she didn't share at work or in negotiations or anywhere that required the armor. It came out of her into the rain and the night and the city that didn't care, and he was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since a restaurant 3 months ago. And this time she looked back and let herself see it for what it was. 3 months later, same city, different restaurant. The light is warm and the service is good, and Nikki Caldwell is 26 years old and sitting at a table with a man she still regularly argues with and has come to trust more thoroughly than almost anyone she knows. She is officially, as of last week, his consigliera. She said yes on a Tuesday morning, in front of Day and 2 others in 4 words, and then immediately presented 3 pages of structural recommendations she'd been holding back as a bargaining chip. Giho had read all 3 pages before he said anything. When he looked up, he was doing the almost smile again. She told him not to push it. She still does the radio. She always will. It is hers the way that few things are hers. Voice and dark and speed and language. The place where she was always most completely herself. Giho still listens live. He has never missed a broadcast since the restaurant. She knows this and does not mention it, and on the nights when the commentary is particularly good, when she is fully midnight and the race is the kind of race that makes the air feel like something worth breathing, she drives home afterward and finds, without surprise, a single text from an unsaved number that just says, good race. She saves everyone. On a Thursday evening 6 weeks after the negotiation, Simone comes to the city and Nikki tells her everything. Start to finish, the robbery and the pillowcase and the gym and the coffee and the meetings and Day refilling her water glass and the rain outside the building and what Giho said about the dark. Simone listens to all of it without interrupting, which is a first. When Nikki finishes, Simone says, I just need to say one thing. Nikki braces herself. I told Keisha, Simone says, that you're going to fall in love with someone who found you interesting instead of useful, and she said I was being romantic and unrealistic. She picks up her drink. I'm going to call her the moment I leave this table. Nikki says, please don't make this a thing. Simone says, this is already a thing. This is the thing. This is the whole thing. Nikki looks at her water glass. She thinks about what it means to be found. Not found out, found. The difference between someone who discovers your secret and someone who hears your voice and decides that voice is the most worth knowing. She thinks about a woman who walked through a career full of difficult people without being broken by any of them, who built a capability so solid that it worked in any room she put it in, who was 26 and tired and went to dinner alone on a Friday and had her entire life reordered by 3 men in bad masks, who wasn't afraid, who was never afraid, who had always, underneath everything, been waiting for something that was actually worth the full measure of what she had. She thinks there are things you cannot plan for, and that is not a flaw in the plan. A different restaurant, a different city, business travel, early dinner. Nikki and Giho are at the same table. They're always at the same table now, which is its own kind of statement, which she has accepted. The food has just arrived. She has finally ordered the galbi again, and this time she intends to finish it. 3 men come through the door. Giho's hand moves toward his jacket. Slow, instinctive. Nikki puts her hand on his arm. He stops. She looks at the men. She takes them in, the energy, the posture, the equipment, or lack thereof. One of them is wearing a Halloween mask, the kind from a gas station rack. It is a skull. It is not a convincing skull. She sighs. Gentlemen, she says in the voice that has been called devastating and precise and extraordinary, and by 3 men in a restaurant 3 months ago, genuinely terrifying. That is a party store skull mask that retails for $4 and is designed for children between the ages of 8 and 12. We're going to talk about this. Giho leans back in his chair. He crosses his arms. He looks at the woman sitting across from him. 26, unshakable, black and brilliant and completely, entirely herself. And what is on his face is not composure and not strategy and not the careful neutral expression he maintains for a world that needs to see him as untouchable. What is on his face is love. Simple, clear, without architecture or armor. She handles the situation in 3 minutes. She comes back to the table, picks up her fork, and says, without looking up, "Don't say anything." He says nothing. He is, however, smiling 1, maybe 4 times in his life. She knows this. She has been counting. She eats her galbi. She lets herself smile too. The moment lasts exactly 40 seconds. Then Giho's phone buzzes. Once. He glances at it the way he glances at everything. Briefly, efficiently, without telegraphing a reaction. This time he goes still. Not the regular stillness. Not the composed, architectural stillness she had learned to read as his default. This was something different. This was the stillness of a man who has just seen something he was not expecting and is deciding, very rapidly, what it means. Nikki sets her fork down. "Giho." He looks up. His face is back to neutral. Too neutral, too quickly, which is the tell she has learned to watch for. "It's nothing," he says. "You don't have a nothing face," she says. "You have a everything is fine face that you use specifically when everything is not fine. Those are different faces, and I know both of them." He looks at her for a moment. Then he turns the phone over on the table, face down. "We'll talk about it later," he says. She looks at the phone. She looks at him. "Giho." He reaches across the table and covers her hand with his, which he has never done in public, not once, in all the months of restaurants and meetings and city nights. The gesture is so deliberate and so unlike him that it stops her completely. "Finish your galbi," he says quietly. She searches his face. She finds, underneath the neutral, something she has only seen once before, on a rainy night in a parking lot, when he told her about a bad year and a decision he hadn't felt good about. A wait, old and specific, and not finished with him the way he'd perhaps believed it was. "What's on that phone?" she says. He is quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moves around them. Somewhere behind her glass is set down. A conversation rises and falls. The city does what the city does. Then he says, very quietly, someone from before. "Before what?" He looks at her with those even, careful eyes. "Before all of this," he says. "Before you." The air between them changes. Nikki Caldwell has walked through 4 years of other people's chaos without blinking. She has talked down rooms and rewritten narratives and held her position in the face of things that would have moved most people sideways. She has never, not once, been the person in the room who didn't know what was coming. She does not know what is coming. And for the first time since a gun cocked in a restaurant and she sighed instead of screamed, Nikki Caldwell feels something cold move through her that has nothing to do with the weather. She picks up her fork. She puts it back down. "We're talking about it tonight," she says. "Yes," he says. "All of it. Yes." She looks at the phone, face down on the table between them, and she thinks about what lies on the other side of the word before. She thinks about a man who has been running an organization for 12 years, who has made decisions he didn't feel good about, who had a bad year that he still hasn't fully explained, who keeps everything and says little, and whose face she can read better than almost any face she has ever studied. She thinks about how knowing someone and knowing everything about someone are 2 completely different things. She thinks, here is the door you didn't see coming. Outside, the city is doing what it always does, lit and indifferent and keeping its own secrets. Somewhere across town, a frequency is sitting quiet, waiting for a voice. Somewhere, a race is being organized that hasn't been called yet. Somewhere, a woman named Midnight has a story she doesn't know she's about to step into. And here, in a restaurant with warm light and good food and a man who is looking at her like she is the most important thing in any room he has ever been in, Nikki Caldwell sets her hands flat on the table, breathes once, and decides something. Whatever is on that phone, whoever is on that phone, she is not afraid. She has dealt with worse. She just doesn't know that yet. What this story is really about, underneath the robberies and the radio and the organized crime and the pillowcase, is something quieter and more true. It is about a woman who was told, in the language of underpayment and undersizing and managed mediocrity, that what she had was useful in a small room, and who found out, on a Friday night she hadn't planned for, that what she had was extraordinary in any room. It's about not shrinking your capability to fit a container that was never built for you. It's about the particular courage of the person who stays calm when everything is falling apart. Not because they feel nothing, but because they have decided that falling apart is not an option, and that decision is its own kind of strength. It's about being found, not by someone who sees your resume or your skills or your output, but by someone who hears your voice in the dark and keeps it. And it's about the fact that sometimes the thing that changes your life doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it walks in wearing a pillowcase. But the thing about a door you didn't see coming, it never comes alone. There is always another one behind it. Darker, heavier, with a lock that requires something you haven't been asked to give yet. Nikki Caldwell has handled everything the world has sent through the door so far. Part 2 is where we find out what she's made of when the door she didn't know existed opens. And what was behind it has been waiting for a very long time. Thank you so much for spending this time with Nikki's story. If you made it all the way to this last word, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for, and we do not take that lightly. Please hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what moment hit you hardest, and whether you're ready for part 2, and subscribe so you're the first to know when it drops. Every like, every comment, every subscription genuinely helps this channel grow and makes it possible for us to keep bringing you stories like this one. We are so grateful for every single one of you. Nikki's not done, not even close.